Right, hello everyone, good morning. Today I would like to talk about a book called The Origins of English Individualism by an academic called Alan Macfarlane. It's a very interesting book. It's kind of blown my mind. I stumbled across this book because I was watching The Lotus Eaters and they had a guy called Raw Egg Nationalist on as a special guest. If you don't know who he is a famous Twitter personality, kind of manosphere type guy, kind of bodybuilding type guy, right-wing dissident type guy, encouraging guys to, go to the gym, get in shape, this kind of thing, be healthy, this kind of thing. And he recently got doxxed by Hope Not Hate earlier on this year, and turns out, yeah, he's like in his 40s, handsome dude, well built. The whole bodybuilding thing was not fake. People made fun of him because apparently he lives with his mum. I don't know, whatever. Maybe he has a good relationship with his mum, right? I mean, we know what rent's like these days. But yeah, he's an academic. He likes to read. And I just thought it was very funny that so many people like came out and made fun of him. I never really followed the guy on Twitter. I wasn't like a huge fan. I was aware of his existence, but that's about it. But people were making fun of him because he's got brown eyes or whatever, and it's like, okay. I mean, lots of English people have got brown eyes. It's not really a big deal. But he seems to have overcome the criticism. Went on the Lotus Eaters, well spoken. I watched a little bit of the interview or the podcast, and he talked about this book, The Origins of English Individualism, which kind of excited me because I am an individualist. I believe in individualism because I believe fundamentally in religious freedom and in freedom of speech. And it is my opinion that you need individualism in order to obtain freedom of speech. And real genius, generally speaking, occurs on an individual level, which is why England and America and the Anglosphere and the German race in general has created so many great inventions and advances in technology and so on and so forth because of individualism. Because if you're going to have a new perspective on something, if you're going to have an original idea, you need to stand on your own 2 feet. You need to be able to disagree with people. You need to be able to have your own thoughts. I mean, I would argue, I've got no evidence for this at all, but I would say that I think it's got something to do with brainwaves. I really do. Like, if you're in a room with a bunch of other people, I think they've done studies on this, like your brainwaves will match their brainwaves. But if you're off by yourself, then your brain will start to function differently. If you spend a lot of time by yourself, your brain will start to function differently and you'll see the world in a different way. Which is why throughout history, hermits have gone into the forest to meditate and to understand God and etc. etc. So I'm a great believer in this. And I despise any society which tries to repress this instinct. I think it's a heroic path, to be honest with you. I think for any man, there's 2 heroic paths you could follow. There's like the path of the warrior, and the greatest achievement for the warrior is to become the king, right? And then there's the path of the ascetic, who just goes off into the forest to meditate and obtain enlightenment. And both of these paths are very individualistic. It's masculine. It's you against the world. It's not about collectivism. So I believe in individualism for all of this. I don't like the online reactionary fascism or reactionary Catholicism. I do not want to live in a totalitarian society. The fascism... I mean, fascism itself comes originally from the Roman Empire. Of course, fascism comes from Italy. I think Mussolini, in part, probably had his inspiration from Karl Marx, who talked about a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's why he called himself a dictator. So that's there. But nonetheless, even Karl Marx himself would have got the concept of a dictator from the Roman Republic, right? From Livy. Okay? So in the Roman Republic, in a time of war, they would shut down democracy. A dictator would come in order to win the war. So I'm not really against this. You could argue here in England we established the first dictatorship in Europe because of Oliver Cromwell, right? Where did he get the idea from? The Romans, probably. I mean, it's the funny thing about England. We literally invented everything. But I'm not against the idea of a temporary dictatorship in order to win a civil war, in order to defeat the enemy, in order to re-establish order. I think that's natural and normal. But a permanent dictatorship is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. And it's not Germanic. It's not the Anglo-Saxon way. And this goes all the way back to looking at our Germanic ancestors who used to... First of all, they lived a very rural lifestyle. They didn't live in big cities. They lived in small kingdoms, if you could call them kingdoms. I suppose that would be the best word for them. And but they would have a drinking hall, and everybody could speak their mind, and they would have a thing. They would have a thing called the thing, okay? And a thing was a meeting, and people would be able to vote at that thing and speak their mind. And so there was a freedom of speech. And this has entered the English language with the word husting. Husting is short for house thing, where you raise your hand and you vote. So this is the real origin of the English Parliament. This is why we had the Witan in Anglo-Saxon Britain. And this is why eventually, after the Norman conquest, the Parliament remanifested itself in a different way. But nonetheless, the spirit of the people of this country wanted to vote, and they wanted representation. So if you're an ethno-nationalist and you're LARPing as a fascist or a Nazi on the internet, then you've kind of missed the point. Because if you look at the English ethnicity, we are Anglo-Saxons, which means that we came over to this island with Hengist and Horsa, which means originally we're from Denmark. And originally, our ancestors were Germanic pagans, and they believed in voting, right? Not in the way that we vote these days, but they had a say, they had a thing, they had a form of democracy. So, and that arose naturally for them. If you look at it from an anthropological point of view, then societies are created by the biology essentially of the people in those societies, right? Africans form war tribes and engage in all kinds of activities because that just suits their behavior. People in the Middle East tend to create a very patriarchal, very totalitarian system of government because that suits their nature. But the Anglo-Saxons, because we are innately individualists, and because we I think it's a higher IQ thing. I think it's high IQ mixed with being slightly aggressive. People want to have their own say and they want to do their own thing. So I believe in freedom of speech because our ancient Germanic pagans essentially believed in freedom of speech. They wouldn't, you'd have to respect the gods and everything, but they didn't have a strict religion like the Christians did, in which you get burned at the stake if you have like the slightly wrong esoteric opinion on some theological point. So they had freedom of speech, and they had freedom of religion, and they had more or less, and they had some kind of vote. Okay, and that's why these days the Englishman craves liberty. So it's very, very foolish for ethno-nationalists to blab on and on about how we need fascism and censorship and a totalitarian government and shut everything down and blah, 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 blah. Like, it's just, it doesn't fit our nature. I understand it as a temporary backlash. Okay, I do have these fantasies myself, just roll out the army, sort the country out. Like, I get it. But long term, men in this country want a say. And they're always going to ask for democracy again. That's why the Enlightenment won. That's why the Enlightenment spread across the whole world and spread democracy across the whole world. That's why Woodrow Wilson's dream of a new world order, which has spread across the whole world. People in general, I guess not just Anglo-Saxons, they like to have a say, they like to have a vote. So there's a lot of anti-democratic feeling on the internet these days because obviously democracy is very corrupt. But I think it's misplaced. I think in general the Enlightenment was a good thing. And I think universal male suffrage is a good thing. Where we've gone wrong is giving women the vote. That's where we've gone wrong. That's where Western civilization has been destroyed. Because the moment you give women the vote, you disempower the men, you feminize the men, and women get involved in government, they get into the civil service, and then they just create a blob of consensus. And then they just agree. Because that's how women are. Women just, cluck and they flap their wings and they agree with each other. I mean, see a group of women talking to each other, it's all like, oh, hi, oh, you look so nice, and your hair, and like they don't, like, whereas men are like, fucking, you're mate, and they take the piss out of each other. It's confrontational. Men are always play fighting, because men are designed to fight. Women don't play fight so much because they're designed to agree with each other. It's a totally different inclination. So once they get involved with democracy, they're all just going to agree with each other. They're going to form a left-wing blob, and they're going to just demand, essentially, to extract taxes from the men to pay for all their stuff. And they'll just ignore. They'll ignore everything. They don't have a problem with the gays because they don't see it as a threat. Men have a visceral reaction to it because it's kind of disgusting, but it's also a threat of assault, and it will damage your honor. Women are all kind of like part lesbian anyway, so they don't really have a problem with it. They also don't want to be shamed, so they're worried if you get puritanical about the homosexual issue, then they'll start getting puritanical with them, and they don't want anybody to criticize them. And so they'll just create this giant big government blob which sits on your country, extracts taxes from the people that work, so that civil servants could just sit there and do nothing. And then they'll push through transgenderism. They'll look in the other direction while foreign men rape young schoolgirls because they don't really care, is the sad part of the truth. The thing you have to understand about women, you think that women would be really, really upset about rape. But actually they're not really. Some of them are. But they're not really, really upset. Why? Because they're not designed for violence. They're just not. They don't have the physical capacity for it, and they don't think in that way. So when a man hears about Rotherham, an English man hears about Rotherham, he gets angry, and he's like, "We've got to do something about this." He feels it in his gut. Women are just like, "Oh," they think like, "Oh, that's a sad thing that happened." That's a sad thing that happened. Let's just all try to get along, though. You know what I mean? So once you've filled your country with these, once you've given these people political power, once you've given the ladies political power, they will emasculate the men, and your country will be turned very, very left wing, and it will get filled up with foreigners because they don't have the capacity to defend a border, right? And the men are emasculated, so they're not going to defend a border. That's like the basic thing that a country should do. That's a basic masculine trait. Defend your territory, right? If you've emasculated the men, then they're not going to defend their territory, and that's it. Boom, gone, wasted, destroyed. So it's for this reason. Like, people are seeing all the problems in the world today, and they're saying, oh my God, it's all democracy's fault. It's not really democracy's fault. We actually reached a civilizational peak with universal male suffrage. This is known as the late Victorian period. The French called it the Belle Epoque, the beautiful age. And it was a great age, and we conquered the whole world, and we had freedom of speech, and we were wealthy, people were well dressed, we had some beautiful architecture, we had a sophisticated culture, which was sort of egalitarian. You had social mobility. And you had families, and it was good, right? It was the Edwardian period. There wasn't all this crime and disaster, and you could buy a house. It was good. It was a good system. So I saw Tucker Carlson give a speech once, and he said the number one automobile, as they like to say in America, the number one car accident in America is the guy hits a tree on the other side of the road. And what does that mean? It means he swerves around something, but he swerves too far, and so he hits something on the other side of the road. So there's a tendency to correct too much, and it seems like a lot of people on the internet are just craving this They see all the rubbish in the world. They're blaming it on democracy, and now they want to correct too much and just dump democracy in the toilet and go straight for a dictatorship. But it's not really necessary. We should remember the Victorian age, right? But of course, people don't do that because a lot of people have been brainwashed by German socialism, and German socialism is anti-imperialism. It's anti-imperialistic at its core, because the Germans were upset about the British Empire, right? And they wanted to compete against it, and they struggling, and etc., etc. So there's a lot of rhetoric of like, oh, the empire is peak capitalism, and the empire, they never cared about us, and because there's all this anti-imperial rhetoric on the internet, it kind of turns into like anti-Victorian rhetoric, and so people end up calling for a dictatorship, and they end up saying like collectivism and individualism is bad. And I mean, I understand it. Like, we live in an age of hyper individualism, which has led to total family breakdown and so on and so forth. But throwing away the vote is not a good idea. Throwing away freedom of speech is not a good idea. So there's my little introductory ramble. Let's talk about the book. The book is a very academic book. I mean, I enjoyed it. It kind of blew my mind away. Certainly opened my eyes to some aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture, the way we behaved hundreds of years ago. But it is an academic book. I know I'm not complaining because it doesn't pretend to be popular history. I'm just saying, like, I wouldn't recommend that you read it, right? That's all. Unless you're really, really into the subject matter. You probably could have condensed this down into like I don't know, 50-page essay or something, like, and skipped all the references and all that lot. So it is a very academic book. It's not that long. It's 200 pages. It's okay. And it doesn't actually seek out the origins of English individualism. And the author himself, Alan Macfarlane, admits this. He says that the title is misleading. So, okay, fair enough. But it's not... He doesn't discover the origins of English individualism because he runs out of evidence, because he's looking at primary evidence. Okay? So he's looking at diaries, and he's looking at... legal records and all this kind of stuff, right? He points towards the origins of English individualism, but he doesn't actually go there himself because he hasn't done the research, because he's an academic, and that's just the way academics think. Okay, so it's an academic book. It's full of quotes of like, this medievalist author has said this, and that medievalist author said that, and this is the evidence, and this is the counter evidence, and boom, 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 right? So he doesn't go to the origins of English individualism, but he points at it. And he points at it by mentioning a French Enlightenment author who goes by the name of Montesquieu. And Montesquieu wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws. Yeah, I just looked it up. He's actually a French judge, but he wrote a book called The Spirit of the Law in 1748. And in this book, he calls for a separation of powers. So we know, like in America, you have a separation of the executive, the Senate, and the judiciary. They're supposed to be separated. In reality, it's been taken over by the blob, right? As I've just mentioned, we gave women the vote, blah, blah, you know, everything's fallen to pieces. But nonetheless, Montesquieu advocated for a separation of powers in order to maintain liberty. I don't really know what to think about this, to be honest with you. Like, I guess he's just kind of saying you're supposed to have different institutions in your country, and they should be wrestling with each other, and because they're competing with each other for power, you'll get a little bit of freedom within that competition, I suppose. I mean, there's something to it for sure, but it's kind of like saying these days we have corporate capitalism, so now you've got a choice between buying an iPhone or a Samsung phone, and that's your choice, right? That's your choice, you peasant. That's your competition. You get the choice between two giant oligarchic institutions. it's not really much of a choice. So I don't really know how I feel about Spirit of the Lost. But anyway, nonetheless, very famous Enlightenment author, wrote this book. And in this book, or in some of his other writings, I don't know, he mentioned that he thinks that the real origin of English individualism can be traced all the way back to the legal code of the Germans and back to, Hengist and Horsa and the Saxons and Denmark and all of that, as I've already stated in this video. So he's in agreement with me. Well done, Montesquieu. So Alan Macfarlane, in this book, he writes the book, calls it The Origins of English Individualism, admits that he doesn't actually get to the origin, but he quotes Montesquieu and says, and right at the end of the book, he says, I think that's where it is. I think that's where the origin is. But he hasn't done the academic study, so he doesn't get there. He only goes back as far as 1250. All right? So I don't know. I mean, it's a misleading title, but whatever. Very interesting. I've already said I think Germanic paganism is where it's at. So, but how does the book start? The book, essentially, what he's trying to say is there's no such thing as an English peasant. Okay? And what he means by this is he talks about peasant society, what historians and anthropologists agree is a peasant society. And then he compares it to English society, and he just says that kind of thing never existed here. And people use the word peasant out of habit to talk about the lower classes of England, but really it doesn't apply. Okay, so what is a peasant? He talks about India, he talks about China, he talks about Poland and Eastern Europe and these kinds of places, and he states that peasants live in a kind of quasi-communal society. They live in almost like a clan-like structure, so big extended family living together on the land together. So 2-3 generations in the same house together, and the cousins, uncles and aunties and etc. and the nephews together in the same space and farming the same land. And here's the crucial point: they would not be able to sell the land. Okay, so the land was owned by the group. Okay, there was no individual private property. And here I am at the 22nd minute getting to the heart of what Alan Macfarlane believes the origins of English individualism is. It's absolute ownership of private property, and it's the ability to alienate your children. Okay, very interesting word, alienate. What does that mean? The ability to sell your land and not give it to your son, essentially. That has been a key component in English law, which has led to this English individualism. But in a traditional peasant society, parents did not have the right to sell the land. They just would not have been able to do it, because it was considered that the sons had a right to the land. So you end up with this very patriarchal society. You end up with young marriages for the females, so teenage marriages generally across the board for the women, and a very conformist society, because you're living in your clan, and that's it, right? You can't go off and buy land somewhere else because nobody's selling any land, right? You can't go off and sell your labor working for somebody else because nobody's hiring. Okay, so in a traditional peasant society, the peasants would live on the land, and they would produce everything they need on that land. They would grow all the food they need. They would make their own clothes. They would fix their own houses. They would fix everything. It's like survivalism, essentially. For all the survivalists out there, you want this to live off the land. That's the way you do it. You have to do it with a big extended family. It's not really possible. I mean, it is very interesting, actually. You look at Anglo society. The ideal for survivalism would be that book Walden, Okay, I think it's American Transcendentalism, isn't it? I haven't read the book, but the cabin in the woods, right? Even Uncle Ted Kaczynski, had a cabin in the woods, right? It's actually become a horror motif. There's a movie called The Cabin in the Woods, good film, by the way. It just shows you how much the urban elite are just terrified of the idea of like a cowboy living out in the forest somewhere. So when the Anglos think about individualism, or living off the land, or survivalism, it's always like one guy living in a cabin by himself and doing everything himself. And that's not really how it was done in ancient times. If you want to be a true, truly live off the land by yourself, you do it with a family and an extended family all together. And that's how you get all the work done. Otherwise, you're going to be overburdened with like too many jobs to do, essentially. The workload needs to be shared. So it's interesting that we have this like individualistic, survivalist perspective in Anglo society. The hermits, or the guy that just fed up with civilization, go and live in the forest by himself with his wife and his couple of kids. It's just not the way it was really done. So anyway, the point I'm getting at is in peasant society, you had communal living and communal ownership of the land. You didn't really have private property in the way that we understand it. So very conformist, very patriarchal, young marriages for the girls, and you didn't have men moving around the place. Like there wasn't really, there was a very low level of social mobility, and you didn't really have this thing where people would just move around the country and go here and go there, or leave the village and go to the town and then come from the town back to the village. Like people just didn't do it. And that was what society was like in China, in India, and in Poland, and in other parts of Europe, but not in England. Now, the main capitalist narrative, as established by Karl Marx, and he talks about Max Weber as well, also Jewish, I think, I'm not sure. The narrative in this country, the sociological narrative, the political narrative, is that we used to be a peasant society, and then the Reformation happened, and because of the Reformation, gradually we transformed into a capitalist society. The communal peasant society got broken up, and we created a labor market, one of the foundations of capitalism, the ability to go here and there and sell your labor, and a land market, the ability to buy land, sell land. All of this appeared out of the Reformation, according to Karl Marx, and created the foundations for capitalism, essentially. And the Industrial Revolution and all of the rest followed from that point onwards. That is like the Marxist interpretation of history, and it's pretty much accepted by everybody. I've said it many times myself. This guy, Alan Macfarlane, says that it's wrong. He says, actually, we had a land market, people buying and selling land, before the Reformation. Okay, before we gave up on Catholicism and tore down the monasteries and so on and so forth. We had this. We even had it before the Black Death. A lot of people say Black Death was the foundation stone for much social mobility and liberty in this country, because so many people died that peasants could afford to buy land and sell their labor and so on and so forth, and things moved on from there. But Alan Macfarlane traces it all the way back to 1250, which is before the Black Death, and he says even at that time, looking at the records of the manors and so on and so forth, even at that time, men could buy land, and sell their labor. And there was a labor market, and there were records of people coming in and out of community. They just didn't have this kind of... We just did not have this kind of really, really deeply settled culture whereby, one family lives on a piece of land and they've been living there for 200, 300 years or whatever. It just didn't happen in England, not according to the research that this guy's done. We just did not have that communal peasant society. We always had the ability to buy and sell land. And that is the foundation for individualism. The ability to buy and sell land. You've got your own land. You're in control. You're in charge. You can say to your children, you can say to your son, like, if you want this, you got to do what I tell you to do. And you've got a labor market and you've got a land market. So that's the main thrust of the book right there. We've always been an individualist country. We've always had late marriages for the women, which is an interesting point that comes out of this. This is a point which I've been arguing back and forth on the internet for some time. I've been saying, look, in a real traditional medieval society, you would have teenage marriages, okay? And then people have been saying, no, it's not true, and blah, 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 back and forth. But it actually appears that it actually really wasn't true. Like in Anglo-Saxon society back in 1250, women were getting married in their mid-20s, right? And the men would get married late as well. The men would leave home, go and work somewhere else, accumulate wealth, save up, buy land. And basically, once you've brought land, you can get a wife and you can have kids, and then the process repeats itself. And that was the way it worked. And parents lived separately to their children. They always lived separately to their children. He talks about how there are many records of court cases of people essentially signing contracts with their children, because you have the elderly parents, they want their son to live with them and look after them, and they would sign a physical contract with their son to ensure that the son would look after them and wouldn't just steal the property off, well, not steal, but wouldn't just kick them out of the house, essentially. So they'd give the property to the son would move in, and the fear of the parents was that they'd get kicked out. So they'd make a whole flipping contract, like my son will feed me 10 turnips a week or whatever, some crazy thing like that. So the boomer problem, okay, has been here for a long time. The boomer problem of the older generation accumulating the wealth, not passing it on to their kids, and the kids have to fight and struggle to get the land. It's been here for a long, long time. It's part of our society. It's part of our culture. It's the Anglo-Saxon way. It is what it is. Now, of course, in the modern age, the boomer problem is a lot different because we have pensions and we have mass immigration. Okay? And essentially what's going on in our country right now is kind of horrific if you think about it, because really what's going on is you have boomers bringing immigrants into the country so that those immigrants can work and pay for their pensions, right? And if you ask most boomers, they'll say, well, that's not what's going on, but it kind of is. There's what people say is going on, and then there's what actually is going on. And what actually is going on is that the boomer vote, the pensioner vote, is the strongest voting bloc in the country. There's a lot of them. They're old and they vote. Younger people just don't vote that much. And every politician in the country is concerned with pensions and concerned with keeping the pensioners happy, because they know that they need the pensioners to vote for them, right? So they have a very powerful stranglehold on the politics of this country. Are they using that power to stop immigration? No. I mean, to be fair to the boomers, I think a lot of them did vote for Brexit, and a lot of them supported UKIP, and a lot of them supported reform, and they like Nigel Farage, or at least some of them do. So it's not all bad, but there are a lot of boomers on the internet. You can see these people. You can talk to them in real life. They're old. They've got grey hair. You talk to them, and they'll say, "Well, we need immigrants to work," right? And it's like, okay, well, what are you actually saying when you say that? Well, they're actually, because they're not working, they're retired. What they're actually saying is they need immigrants to work to pay for their pension. So they're inviting in a slave class to replace the native population. Not only that, to replace their children and their grandchildren. They're inviting this slave class in to work so that they can sit at home and do nothing. Right? This is the boomer problem that we face. It's kind of horrific. but it is what it is, right? So the boomer problem has been there a long time. It is part and parcel of English individualism, because as this book points out, English individualism is built on the ability to own land and have absolute ownership over that land. So you can buy it, you can sell it, and you don't have to care what your son thinks about it or what your daughter thinks about it. You can alienate them. The word alienation, I'm going to have to do a video one day and just talk about alienation for an hour, because it is such an interesting concept. The idea comes, and I don't understand this fully, but it's originally like a legal term, in that you alienate somebody means you sell something, right? And then it became a Marxist term, in that Karl Marx said the workers of the world are alienated because they're separated from the means of production, so they don't own the factories that they work in, essentially. The rich capitalist owns this stuff, the workers don't own it, which is kind of, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. It's a similar kind of concept. And then it became a psychological concept. It's very popular in the 90s, with grunge and the kind of Gen X reaction to boomerism that was appearing in the culture then, with people just saying, it's Kurt Cobain, right? Here we are now, entertain us. I'm alienated. It's Radiohead. It's Creep. I'm alienated. I'm not connected to society. I don't feel like I'm connected. I don't feel like I fit in. So it starts off as a legal term, turns into a Marxist term, and then turns into a psychological term. But you can see the connection there. It's like you don't own land. You don't own any property. So you're not in control. And then, of course, Ted Kaczynski doesn't actually use the word alienation in his manifesto, but he does talk about how he's essentially talking about the same thing. Like, we're not survivalists. We don't live off the land. We don't grow our own food. We don't know how to build our own houses. We're not in control of the technology. We're just like a tiny little part of a bigger machine. We go to the supermarket to buy food. We don't know how the food is made. We're driving a car. We don't know how the car is made. We're part of a system, but we don't understand how the system works. So we don't have our feet on the ground. We're not grounded. We're not in control. And again, he doesn't use the word alienation, but that's essentially what he was talking about. You're alienated. So you're unhappy. You're psychologically upset, right? And one of the solutions he proposed for this, he didn't propose this as a solution. He pointed out that some people adopt this as a solution, and that is that the idea that you should create art, because by creating music or writing a story or whatever, you're in control of that. You're fully in control of that. That is yours. That is an expression of your individual soul. So it's a way of expressing power. But essentially, he was talking about disempowerment and alienation. So very interesting term. How it starts with a legal term, turns into a Marxist term, turns into a psychological term, and I guess the whole white English race is being alienated now, isn't it? We're being alienated from our native home. Okay, we're being turned into aliens. And that's another thing. Illegal alien, right? Mass immigration. So I'm going to have to do a video about that word at some point. It's a very interesting word. Immigration itself, very interesting word. This is something I struggled with like 10 years ago. Like, what's the difference in immigration and emigration? Technically speaking, emigration means you move from one country to another. Immigration means you move within a country. So we've got people complaining about immigrants. I'm one of them. I do it all the time. I don't use emigration as a word. But there's a little sleight of hand there. There's a little shift in meaning there. Because by using the word immigrant, you're kind of saying that, I don't know, we all live in a one world government and it's just movement within the country or something like this. You know what I mean? Technically speaking, these are illegal emigrants, not immigrants. So very interesting how words change their meaning over time. Nonetheless, the point of the book is that individualism, English individualism, is built on property rights. We can see it in the legal system. We can see it in libertarianism. We can see it in John Locke. John Locke is the father of modern day libertarianism, so the father of America, essentially. One of the great founding fathers of America. Obviously before all that, but nonetheless, he did actually go to America and get inspired by America in the early days of the colony. And what's he talking about? Property rights. Property rights, property rights, property rights. That's it. That's the core of libertarianism. That's the core of liberty. You got to own your own property. You got to stand on your feet. I believe in this. I think, this has just reinforced my view on the subject matter, to be honest with you. I've been saying for a long time, if you want a free, happy society, you have to have a strong middle class. What does that mean? It means property ownership and ownership of small businesses, instead of what we've got now is a society that rents and everybody works for a corporation. This is something that's happened in America. People nowadays, people think they're middle class if they've got a good job in a corporation. It's like, well, you're not really standing on your own 2 feet, are you? Because now you've got to do what human resources tells you to do, and maybe you're getting paid a big wage, but you're getting bossed around. So if you want liberty, you need practical liberty, and practical liberty would mean you own your own house. Because if you own your own house, then you don't have to worry so much, right? You don't have to worry about paying rent. You don't have to worry about paying the mortgage. So you don't have to worry about being made homeless, because nobody wants to be made homeless. If you're homeless, you lose all your wealth, and you got to start again, because it's not just you lose your property, you lose everything that's in the property, including your books, your TV, your clothes, all your stuff. Now you're on the street and you got nothing. You got nothing. I know I'm stating the obvious, but I don't know how, people watching this or listening to this, I don't know if you've ever faced homelessness before. Like, if you ever had a crisis in your life where it's like, oh shit, I can't pay the rent. I have, and it's scary. It's really scary. It's terrifying. And that fear is in the back of everyone's head. And it's that kind of fear, or everyone that rents anyway, or everyone that rents has a mortgage. Because, imagine that. You got a mortgage. You pay into it for 10, 20 years, and then, something goes wrong. You can't pay the mortgage. You lose it all. It's terrible. So the fear is there, and the fear will keep you in line. It will keep you, when human resources tells you there are 24 different genders or whatever, you'll just say yes sir, because you don't want to lose your job, because you don't want to be made homeless. Whereas if you own your own house, you don't have to worry so much, so you're more able to speak your mind. In addition, if you run your own business, you work for yourself, you can speak your mind. Or if you work in a small business which is a family business, right, they're probably not going to tell you what to do, because they probably won't have human resources. You'll deal with everything on a more informal level, so you've got more freedom of speech, right? So if you want a real free society, having a constitution which guarantees you freedom of speech is not enough. What you need is practical liberty. That practical liberty has to be built on a strong middle class, and that middle class has to be built on property ownership and ownership of small businesses. Once that's gone, it doesn't matter if you've got a well-paid kind of management class. It doesn't matter. They don't have a foot to stand on. And so that well-paid corporate job, all of a sudden the corporation will turn around and they'll be like, well, we don't have to pay you so much anymore, and we can afford to pay you less. And then everything sinks down, and then you've got a society where you've got a lot of rich people on the top and a lot of poor people on the bottom. And even if it is a democracy, it's going to be a kind of tyranny, because the people are poor. People are poor, they're desperate, and they can be pushed around, right? So the real struggle in this world is not really between capitalism and socialism. It's more like it's between big business and small business, and it's between families and the government, essentially. And the foundation stone for all of that is property ownership. One interesting thing that I've stumbled across in recent years is looking at Attlee, and Clement Attlee, who was the Labour Prime Minister who came in after the Second World War. One of the things that he did was introduce planning permission, right? Which kind of blew my mind away. I'm like, well, what do you mean? What? He introduced the idea of planning permission. The idea that if you own a piece of land, you have to ask the government if you're allowed to build a house on it. We didn't have this before. Before this, if you own a piece of land, you do what you want with it. You want to turn it into a business, you do a business. You want to build a house, you build a house. It's your land, you do what you want. Clement Attlee changed this. So, massive infringement of property rights. Now you own a bit. I lived in Hong Kong for a while. In Hong Kong, you can turn your house into a restaurant, right? If you want to. And just invite people in. Essentially invite people around for a dinner party. And they pay. It's like a real cheap, easy business to set up. You don't need to have a restaurant or zonal permits or whatever. No, it's your house. It's your flat. Everyone lives in a flat there. It's your flat. You do what you want with it. You want to run a business out of your flat. You can do that, right? Got so many rules against that now. So you're crushing small businesses. You're crushing the ability of people to build their own property. It's incredibly tyrannical. I never even really thought about it before, funnily enough, before I stumbled across the fact that Clement Attlee passed that. Or, of course, you've got the Communist Manifesto, 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. One of those planks is an attack against, is an inheritance tax. Okay? And they market this as something which will stop the rich people from passing their wealth on to their children. But it doesn't work like that at all, because the rich will just hire a lawyer, figure out a loophole and get round it. What actually happens is the middle class gets taxed out of existence. So people work their entire lives to buy a property and accumulate wealth. They want to give it to the kids, and the government steps in and steals it. It's horrendous. All of this is an attack on the middle class. All of this is communist thinking. It's all built on... It's kind of like a romantic... I do find it interesting that philosophically communism as an ideology, Karl Marx obviously the manifesto was written in 1848. They came after Romanticism. So what I mean by that, if you look at the intellectual development of Europe, you've got the medieval period, then you've got the Renaissance, the Rebirth, then you've got the Reformation, then you've got the Enlightenment. We're still living in the age of we're living in the age of the Renaissance. All of these ages are still present today, but after the Enlightenment, they say you have the Romantic period. Okay, so a rejection of rational thought and embracing of emotion and irrational thought, but also a looking back to the medieval period. Okay, and this, they say that this occurred in reaction to industrialization and all of this. People were just like, whoa, dude. And they started looking at like knights in shining armor fighting against dragons and all this kind of stuff, and started looking at like the disappearing quote unquote peasantry and all the folk songs and folk stories which have just been wiped out by industrialization and by the Enlightenment. As people were scrambling around Europe trying to like find this stuff before it was just completely disappeared. And you got the appearance of romantic nationalism. I mean, arguably Germany is a romantic nationalist state, isn't it? Sort of. Nazi Germany, that is. I mean, it does have some roots in that kind of movement. But nonetheless, I do find it interesting that Marx... if you read the comment, I've never read Das Kapital because it's 3,000 pages long and I just can't be arsed with it, but I will get around to it one day. But if you read the Communist Manifesto, there is a little bit of a mention there of, in medieval times we lived communally. It's like, it says this like little glimmer of like the utopian peasant life, essentially. But it's a utopian peasant life that never really existed in England. Maybe in India, maybe in China, maybe in Eastern Europe. Not really here. Okay? And of course the communists, they have this little glimmer of, wouldn't it be nice if we all just lived together and shared stuff? And then they just tear the entire world down and create a totalitarian state, right? So there's another point which I wanted to make. I've only got 10 minutes left. I should have made this point earlier. But the book doesn't mention at all the Treaty of Merton. I keep calling it the Treaty of Merton. The Statute of Merton. Okay? Which I find very interesting. This is, as far as I understand it, the first statute. You can look it up on Wikipedia. Passed in 1235. And the first statute of the English realm. The first statute of Parliament. Okay, it says here on the Wikipedia page that the first statute in the Statutes of the Realm. So the Statutes of the Realm is an authoritative collection of acts of the Parliament of England from the earliest times to the Union of Parliaments in 1707. So this is the first statute. Essentially comes straight after Magna Carta. And what does it do? It allows the statute... It allows the Lord of the Manor to enclose common land. Boom. Massively, like, I'm amazed that more people aren't talking about this. People should be talking about this every day. The Statute of Merton completely transformed the country. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Essentially, okay, and again, the book just doesn't go into it at all, but I've been saying for some time, right? I don't want to make this more than an hour long, so I'm just going to dabble into this point and then stop the video. But my rhetoric for some time has been that Christianity pushed us into slavery. Okay, so Constantine the Great established Constantinople, converted to Christianity, and whilst he did this, he also made laws so that quote-unquote peasants or serfs or whatever. He essentially created serfdom by making people pay their taxes at the local manor. So he established the manorial system, which is the feudal system, which is manor houses with serfs. And a serf is a person who lives on the land and is connected to the land and owned by the land, right? So he pushed Europe into slavery. And he pushed Europe into this quote-unquote sort of communal lifestyle, but not really. It's manorial lifestyle. So this has been one of my complaints about Catholicism for some time. I've been going along with the idea that we were liberated by this through the Reformation, but according to this book, that's not really what happened. We always had this system of land sale. But now this book, again, he traces the history back to 1250, and he doesn't talk about the Statute of Merton. So it seems to me that, again, I don't know because I haven't done the research, I haven't looked at the primary sources, and I don't know if anybody else has, but I'm just going to put this out as a speculation. So as far as English liberty goes, you've got ancient Germanic liberty and land ownership. And then Hengist and Horsa come over here, the Anglo-Saxons, and we've got Saxon liberty and Saxon land ownership. And it's Christian, but maybe it's not as bad as in Europe, right? And then the Normans come over, sponsored by the Venetians, by the way. And William the Conqueror, William the Bastard, brings over the Jews as the tax collectors. Writes the Doomsday Book. Every single part of the land gets counted and measured. And then now we've got Norman feudalism. Now my guess is in Norman feudalism, you have more intense tyranny and serfdom. Then you have, of course, the Crusades. Richard the Lionheart goes off to the Middle East. Okay, England is the proto-Zionist nation. While he's away, King John is the king. Nobody likes him. There's a war with the nobles. Magna Carta is born, and the rebirth of English liberty, the rebirth of Saxon liberty. And you can say, well, those lords and nobles would have been Norman descent, and it's like, yeah, but maybe they were inspired by the peasants. I don't know. But you've got this kind of rebirth of Saxon liberty. Parliament is established. The first act that Parliament establishes is the Statute of Merton. And what does this do? It allows landlords to enclose the land, which means build a hedge around it, essentially. So instead of having this wide, open, common land owned by all the people of England and serfdom, now the landlords are saying, no, that piece of land is mine. I have absolute ownership of it, and I can buy it, I can sell it, and so on and so forth. And this has been a huge issue. Hundreds of years of English history, the gradual enclosure of the land. It started off small, it got big, right? Until you go into the English countryside, everything's protected by a hedge. Okay, and this is all tied up, by the way, with wool, with sheep, people making money out of sheep. So peasants getting kicked off the land so the rich landlord can raise a sheep and make money out of the wool, and so on and so forth. A lot of things going on here. It's got a huge influence on the English Civil War. The Levellers, who fought in the English Civil War with Oliver Cromwell against the Crown. Where does the term leveller come from? It comes from this idea of levelling the land. So they would knock down hedges. They were anti-enclosure riots. They were fighting against enclosure, fighting for their common land. So it's a huge theme in English history, and this book doesn't touch on it at all, right? So I just don't understand. Like, this book just doesn't deal with serfdom. I don't think he even mentions the word serf in the entire book. So what the hell is going on? He says that he traces the primary sources back to 1250. Well, the Statute of Merton was in 1235. Could it be that the origins of English individualism can be traced back to the Statute of Merton? Right, back to Magna Carta, Statute of Merton, back to enclosure, and people can buy their land, enclose it, put a hedge around it, put some sheep on it, whatever. And then this just started spreading like wildfire across England until all the land got enclosed, and you had this capitalist country, essentially, this proto-capitalist country with land ownership and a moving, working labour class, a labour market, right? And also a money market as well, people buying stuff from, instead of making the stuff themselves, right? All these are the original elements of capitalism. Could it be that all of this is traced back to the Statute of Merton? I don't know, because the book doesn't flip and talk about it. It doesn't even talk about serfdom itself. So, because the guy's an academic and he just wanted to do his little academic study, and he doesn't, speculate as well as I do. So a lot of unanswered questions. I'm going to go out on the limb with 2 minutes remaining and say, my opinion is we had our Saxon liberty and Germanic paganism. Hengist also came over, Alfred the Great, all of that. We had Saxon England. We still had liberty. The Normans plunged us into tyranny, and then Magna Carta and Statute of Merton's kind of raised us back out of it. That's my take, but I don't know. But that's what I'm going to go with. Okay, guys. So very interesting subject matter. Ownership of land. Ownership of land. The ability to kick your children off the land. The ability to be a boomer, right? That's the origin of English individualism. Okay, the ability to just squander your children's inheritance. That is the origin of English individualism. It's all about the land. It's all about property ownership. It's all about absolute ownership of property. And it creates and oh, by the way, like by the way, I mean, this guy quotes a long, maybe this sounds terrible and horrible and capitalistic and nasty to you, but the guy quotes a long series of different letters and foreigners coming to England and English people going to foreign lands and commentaries and so on and so forth, just pointing out how wealthy the English were in comparison to other countries like France or even Germany or Italy. We were considered to be a very, very, very wealthy country because of this system, because of the system of absolute property ownership. So it worked. I mean, it's a tough system, because as a young man, you've got to leave home at 14, you've got to go to the local marketplace, and you've got to become an apprentice for somebody, and you've got to work. So you make enough money so that you can buy land, and if you don't do that, you're not going to have a wife and you're not going to have any kids. So it's a tough system. It's not like the classic peasant system where you just sit on the land, you know you're going to inherit it, you don't have to work so hard, you just kind of like go along with things and you'll get looked after. Our system, the Anglo-Saxon system, is a tough system, but it creates greatness. And it's why we became such a great nation. And it created a lot of wealth. And it leads towards freedom of speech and science and conquering the world, essentially. And we've forced this system on the whole world now, by the way. The communal system, the old tribal kind of communal system around the world has just been wrecked by English common law. Is our system of individualism suitable for Indians or Chinese people or Africans? Possibly not. And that's a big question. And that's probably another reason why this stuff gets criticized so much. Because anthropologists have gone out there and they've looked at what our legal system has done to these kind of like happy little peasant communal societies in like Vietnam or Malaysia or wherever, you know. So it might not be a system that's for everybody, but it certainly does appear to be our system. I don't think it just comes from the Statute of Merton. I think the Normans crushed us and we rebounded. That's my take on it. But who knows? Who knows? But anyway, guys, thank you very much for listening. Very interesting subject matter. Enjoyed talking about this. God bless you all. Goodbye.